of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, President Trump's midterm prediction.
You got to win the midterms, because if we don't win the midterms, it's just going to be, they'll find a reason to impeach me. I'll get impeached.
President Trump speaking to congressional Republicans today, outlining what he says is next for Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro. We'll get into it all when Democratic Congressman Deluzio of Pennsylvania and Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida join up ahead.
Plus the rhetoric around Greenland escalating as the Danish premier now sounding the alarm over the U.S. threats. Greenland and Denmark now demanding to meet with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and more. We'll get insights from former U.S. Ambassador to Denmark, Rufus Gifford, joins us moments from now.
And we're waiting for a potential Supreme Court decision on the White House's broad-based tariff policy. What the president is now saying about the case coming up.
We begin this evening with the latest from the White House. The president speaking before congressional Republicans, House Republicans, at their winter gathering today. Trump commenting on everything from China to Russia to the midterms and tariffs, Greenland and more. But it was, of course, Venezuela that was top of mind for lawmakers in Washington, with the dust yet to settle, from the administration's operation over the weekend. Listen.
152 airplanes, many. Talk about boots on the ground. We had a lot of boots on the ground. They knew we were coming, and they were protected, and our guys weren't. Our guys are jumping out of helicopters, and they're not protected, and they were. But it was so brilliant. The electricity for almost the entire country was, boom, turned off.
Joining us now with the latest is Bloomberg's Courtney Subramanian, who is reporting live from the White House North Lawn tonight for us. Courtney, President Trump's addressing congressional lawmakers today. This was designed to outline those priorities for the year ahead. So what is the White House's message when it comes to the stakes of these midterm elections?
Well, it was very interesting because this was supposed to be a speech to galvanize Republicans, as you said, about the election year ahead. But it was pretty revealing. We saw the president acknowledge the political vulnerabilities he sees in the midterm election. He talked about, how the Republicans needed to win, otherwise he was going to be impeached. He urged Republican lawmakers to set aside their differences and really focus on selling his agenda. And this, of course, comes as the White House has tried to refocus their efforts on those cost of living issues that we have seen as a top concern for American voters, and also an issue that helped propel Democrats in their off-year election victories in November. That, of course, has been complicated by the administration's weekend military operation in Venezuela that saw the capture and arrest of President Nicolas Maduro. But this was supposed to be a pep talk, and it certainly was more a plea to his party about the year ahead.
A plea instead of a pep talk. Courtney, here we sit 5 years after the fact, the January 6 riots, and just worth noting the significance of him gathering the House Republican Conference on January 6th to talk about the agenda and actually get to impeachment. What do we make of this prediction he made? If Democrats take control of the House, he will be impeached and it will ruin the country. What would they impeach him on?
Well, there is a lot of different issues. We've seen some signals from the Democrats about, their thought that he's overreaching. He's not seeking authorization from Congress on several issues, including the power of the purse, the deployment of the National Guard, and, of course, this military operation in Venezuela, which is top of mind for a lot of lawmakers. But the president has been clear. He does tie the results in November to, his legacy and whether he will face another impeachment if the Democrats retake control of one of the houses of Congress.
Quite a moment we're in. Courtney, it's great to have you on board, and thanks for your reporting at the White House. Bloomberg's Courtney Subramanian reporting live from the North Lawn. We thank you. Joining us now with his reaction to all of this, live from Capitol Hill, Democratic Congressman Deluzio of Pennsylvania, who serves on both the House Armed Services Committee and the House Transportation Committee. I've got to ask you, Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Your thoughts on this? If Democrats win the midterms, you're going to impeach President Trump?
Well, we got a key step there is to win the midterms. And I think any politician who gets ahead of themselves of going to the voters to win makes a mistake. And look, what I see happening is a president who is failing at the fundamental job that he was elected to do, which is to make life less of a ripoff and more affordable for people. And in the face of that and those failures, he's going to now take on running Venezuela, paying for and putting at risk American lives for an occupation that the American people did not support. I think it's foolish, it's politically disastrous for him, and it's bad for the country. He should step back here, come to Congress, come to the American people, and get back to the job that we need our government to succeed at, which is a strong and stable environment, certainty in the market, more affordable life for people. No one's voting for regime change in Venezuela, for crying out loud, or Greenland for that matter.
Well, let's stick on this and stick on Venezuela. Yes, President Trump has said that the U.S. will run the country, but when you listen to other advisors like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, you hear him talk a lot more about this idea that the U.S. has leverage to help enact policies that they want to see in Venezuela, like the oil embargo, like the armada that's still poised in the region. Do you think that the U.S. has enough leverage to make positive change in Venezuela through these sorts of mechanisms?
Well, let's start with Nicolas Maduro stole an election and stayed in power illegitimately. I don't weep for his plight, but the American people have something to say here. And you mentioned some disagreement perhaps between Secretary Rubio and President Trump. President Trump today reminded everyone he's ultimately going to be in charge of this occupation and running Venezuela. So I take him at his word that he's doing this, irrespective of whatever those around him are saying. And I think that's a disastrous decision. I'm a veteran of the war in Iraq. I know, and what my generation of veterans knows what it is to see a regime change war, an occupation all around pursuit of oil. I think it's foolish. And I think it is a thing that will put at risk precious American lives and treasure. There is grave risk in all of this. The administration should step back, work with the Congress, talk to the American people, have this out in the open, a debate. I don't think the American people want to see young Americans risk their lives for a Venezuelan regime change.
Well, I appreciate your view as a veteran congressman, and I'd like you to hear remarks from your colleague from New York, Mike Lawler. Republican congressman had this to say about some of the rhetoric and the reactions that we've heard from the Democratic side of the aisle since overnight Friday when Maduro and his wife were captured. Listen.
Unfortunately, when you have something as sensitive as this, where you're going into Venezuela for the purpose of arresting the, quote unquote president, the illegitimate president, Nicolas Maduro, obviously it's a hypersensitive situation. And frankly, given the response by some of my Democratic colleagues, I don't blame the administration for not advising them in advance of the operation.
So this brings us to the matter of war powers and congressional consultation. Congressman, I know that there's a big briefing tomorrow with yourself and colleagues from both sides of the aisle to get a full briefing from the administration on what took place. Top leaders, including, I believe, your chair and ranking member, were briefed yesterday. Did they have any sense in conversations with you about who or what might be next? Is there another country, Colombia, Cuba, that Congress is not hearing about?
Yeah, and I don't know is the short answer, and that's the problem. And the president and Secretary Rubio and others have talked about those exact places, even Greenland, as recently as today. Remember, the Danes are our NATO allies. This is, to me, just a crazy idea. And to the comments from my colleagues and others, remember, the Constitution is not a suggestion. Article 1 is clear that the Congress, the elected representatives of the people of this country, decide whether we go to war, whether we put Americans in harm's way. I have a simple question to my Republican counterparts and politicians who are beating the drum to war. Are you going to look young Americans in the eye and tell them they should risk their lives? If, God forbid, an American comes back in a flag-draped casket, you're going to look their widows and their families in the eye and tell them it was worth it? That's the standard for whether we send Americans to fight. I haven't seen any of that kind of debate and discussion, engagement with the American people here to get the buy-in that you'd ever need to put this country on a war footing or to occupy a foreign land, as the president now wants to do. Those are questions for the American people. I don't think the American people want to put Americans at risk in that way.
But what about the question for Congress, Congressman? Is there a path of recourse here that we could see lawmakers take in the weeks ahead as we hear about potentially further action, or even the fact that this administration hasn't ruled out the potential for a second wave of strikes, depending on how discussions go between this administration and Delcy Rodriguez?
Look, I'd like to see a war powers resolution effort around whether it's Venezuela or Greenland for the Congress to assert itself and for the administration to hear a loud and clear message. If you want to go do these things, you do not get to decide that on your own. You come, you talk to the American people, and you come to Congress for approval. That is the bare minimum that I think should happen, that you have this debate with the American people. Let's see the evidence from the administration for why they think they need to go invade Greenland, for crying out loud. And so I'd like to see the Congress step up, Democrats and Republicans assert that power on the American people's behalf, and let's have that debate.
Referred to the issue of affordability a couple of minutes ago, Congressman, and I'd like to ask you about health care, because there will be a vote, I believe, Thursday, correct me if I'm wrong, is the floor vote on the discharge petition that will bring a matter before lawmakers on potentially extending Obamacare subsidies, realizing we've already gone over the cliff. Are the votes there to pass that bill on Thursday in the House? And if it does pass convincingly, what happens then? It just dies in the Senate?
Well, I hope the votes are there. And as you probably know and your viewers know, a handful of Republicans came along with Democrats, and I'm glad they did, to force this vote, to force the Speaker's hand to bring this to the floor. Let's pass it. And
a number of Republicans from your state.
Yes, and I'm glad they joined us on this. Look, I'm not here to win political fights. I'm here to do what's right for my constituents. I'm glad they joined us. Let's see this thing pass. Let's see the Senate take it back up and pass it. If I'm Donald Trump, if I'm the president, my goodness, people are getting pounded by health care premiums because his party refused to act. Now you've got some Republicans working with Democrats. He ought to get through this, get these tax credits extended. That's the bare minimum I think this country should do to fix health care in the short term. Then we have some space to work on a longer term fix, because remember, we pay much more than nearly any peer country for health care, and we get worse outcomes. And so I think that we have to have a bigger discussion going forward about health care in this country.
Is there any talk about that looming government shutdown deadline? Is there any appetite on the Hill that we could actually see us going over that deadline in order to get maybe a policy change enacted, or does everything seem smooth sailing now when it comes to appropriations?
Well, there's a deal on the table that I'm still reviewing and others are on mini buses, it's called, spending some of the spending bills that the Congress has to pass as part of that coming deadline. So there's some movement, there's some momentum. It's bipartisan and bicameral, so House and Senate. That's been rare. We'll see. We've got a few weeks still to work through this. I think the country, the economy needs stability out of our government. They need to know that when Congress votes to appropriate funds and spend it, this administration will spend it along the lines that Congress laid out in the law. That's the basic, I think, for the rule of law in this country and for the stability that the markets need, that for businesses and workers need. And so I think they expect that from the Congress, and that's what we ought to be doing.
All right, some cautious optimism there, perhaps, from the Congressman, Democratic Congressman Chris Deluzio of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining us here at Bloomberg. And President Trump says the administration will be speaking with oil companies in the days ahead in the wake of the action in Venezuela. Here's what he told congressional Republicans earlier today.
I'm also meeting with oil companies. Let's go. You know what that's about. We've got a lot of oil to drill, which is going to bring down oil prices even further.
Crude oil prices backed off gains inspired by the administration's actions in Venezuela, with U.S. futures down over 2% to $57 a barrel. But stocks kept pushing higher, with the S&P 500 up more than 0.5%. Let's turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York and has all the details. Hey, Romaine.
Yeah, Tyler, a record day for the Dow and the S&P, but it was actually not necessarily led by big tech, as you would think. You did have some big names like Amazon and Palantir, which did gain on the day, but some of the others were left out. Apple down for a fifth straight day, Cisco down for a sixth, Tesla down for the eighth day in the past 10 sessions here. And it's part of a rotation that we've seen out of some of the bigger tech spaces, not because there's no growth there, but some concerns about valuation and some big questions as to, well, where a lot of that money is going. We heard a little bit earlier today from two of the biggest players in the AI race, Lisa Su, the CEO of AMD, and Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia, still bullish on AI, still bullish on the idea that more money needs to be spent on this. And you started to see a bit of a rotation in that space. Power companies like JCI sold off, cooling companies sold off. Names like AMD and Nvidia were under pressure all day, but memory makers like Western Digital and like SanDisk had phenomenal sessions. In fact, SanDisk has actually been the best performing stock amongst the 1,000 largest companies out there, going all the way back to really that big sell-off that we had in April of last year coming out of Liberation Day, up more than 1,000% over that stretch, and added if you can believe it, more than 20% just today alone. And that is a big part of the story here. I do also want to point out, Tyler, you mentioned what was going on in the commodity space. Oil prices did fall, but metal prices continue that ostensible rise higher. And this is mainly industrial metals we're talking about, with aluminum at its highest levels in a couple of years, copper hitting fresh record highs, and even nickel, which had actually been somewhat of a dormant trade, having its best one-day gain in about 2 years. And Joe, you were alluding to it at the top of the show. We did have some breaking news earlier today on the rare earth story. A lot of that tied to some of comments regarding Greenland, some of that tied to the reports that China is imposing export controls on Japan, and a lot of the critical materials makers having a big day here. In fact, Critical Minerals, the main company at the top of your screen, up 26% here on the day.
Interesting session. Romaine, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick at World Headquarters in New York. Coming up, we'll turn our attention back to Capitol Hill and lawmakers' reaction to the events underway in Venezuela when Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida joins us live. First, President Trump renewing his push for the U.S. to control Greenland. We'll discuss the potential impact on NATO with Rufus Gifford, the former U.S. ambassador to Denmark. Straight ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think what Trump says about Greenland and his interest in taking control of Greenland is very harmful to the NATO alliance. You know, Greenland, part of Denmark, is a NATO ally. Denmark's been an ally of the United States for years, and you have advisors to the president saying on national television that Denmark's claim to the island is illegitimate, and nobody will oppose American force if we decide to use it. If we did, it would destroy the NATO alliance.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew. Having had a conversation earlier today with John Bolton, the voice you were just hearing, the former national security advisor in the first Trump administration, on the early edition of Balance of Power, talking about President Trump's renewed calls to take over Greenland, a move that has been heavily criticized, of course, by European leaders, including the Danish prime minister, with Denmark and Greenland now asking to meet with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and quickly. Joining us now with insights, Rufus Gifford, former U.S. ambassador to Denmark in the Obama administration. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back. When we talked about this a few months ago, everybody was laughing about it. How about now?
People aren't laughing anymore, Joe. And no, they're not. And they're certainly not laughing in Denmark and Greenland. They're not laughing in Europe. They sure as heck should not be laughing in the United States either. I think when you hear the president, when you hear the vice president, when you hear Stephen Miller, what he said yesterday to Jake Tapper, Americans should be afraid, frankly, of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration on this. In large part, I think what John Bolton told you earlier today is right on.
Ambassador, can we talk about some policy, like tangible policy here? What are the potential areas of cooperation between the U.S. and Denmark before we get to an escalation where we see the military involved? Are there other options here on the table that could advance the U.S.'s interest in Greenland?
Well, Tyler, I think that's the entire point here, is that there is not a single person in Denmark or Greenland who would fight the United States' overall interest here. Remember, we used to have a dozen military bases in Greenland during World War II, and we scaled them down after the war and then further after the Cold War. I would make an argument that we have taken our eye off the ball in the Arctic, that we should invest more in Arctic security, but we should be doing them together with our NATO allies. So the essence of your question is, everything should be on the table and is on the table. As long as you do that good hard work and diplomacy, which I have, of course, done over the course of my career, roll up your sleeves and figure out how to get it done. And you should be getting it done with your best allies, some of your best allies in the world, the Danes and the Greenlanders. And in addition to the national security piece, there's the economic piece. I mean, I agree very much that Greenland should be, we should have a deeper economic ties between the United States and Greenland. It probably has large troughs of rare earth minerals that we should be looking at. The Greenlanders Greenlanders and the Danes would welcome American investment in Greenland if we're looking at mining or drilling or or frankly anything. If we're talking about tourism, building hotels, whatever that may be. But again, to poke one of your best allies in the eye is just counterproductive. The Americans in Greenland, certainly the Trump administration, are going to be less welcome there than they've ever been. And that's heartbreaking. I mean, this is an alliance that is something that we have been in lockstep with the Danes and the Greenlanders, certainly for the last 80 years. So it's heartbreaking for me to see it head in the direction that it is heading right now.
Well, as we consider the now, I guess we call it the Donroe Doctrine, I want to just go back through the months of rhetoric here and the evolution of what we've heard from this administration, Ambassador. And it goes back to March. Remember when Vice President J.D. Vance actually flew to Greenland to deliver this message? Listen.
Our message to Denmark is very simple. You have not done a good job by the people of Greenland. You have underinvested in the people of Greenland, and you have underinvested in the security architecture of this incredible, beautiful landmass filled with incredible people. That has to change. And because it hasn't changed, this is why President Trump's policy in Greenland is what it is.
Fast forward to last evening, and Stephen Miller, the president's advisor on CNN. We live in a world that is governed by strength, governed by force, governed by power, he said. These are the iron laws of the world since the beginning of time. And it is our right as the United States to take Greenland. How would you react to him?
My mouth, I am slack-jawed by those remarks, Joe. I mean, how is that not an authoritarian playbook? I don't understand. I mean, those are not the American values that I grew up with. Those are not the American values that I represented when I proudly served our country overseas. It's heartbreaking. And in other parts of that interview, he has a profound misunderstanding of Greenland and NATO. And it's shocking to me that the Deputy Chief of Staff of the White House doesn't understand how the world works. Separately, I do want to mention that J.D. Vance piece you mentioned. The American military officer who ran that base actually sent an email to all of her troops that had to reject what the vice president said to them that day. She, of course, was fired. But this is my point. My point is that the Americans who work with Danes and Greenlanders know better than the Trump administration. And you saw that during Vance's visit there in Greenland. We could obviously cite a million different examples of the partnership.
In the last 30 seconds we have you, Ambassador, can you just shed any light on what U.S.-Denmark communications look like right now?
Oh, government to government, Tyler, it's rough. It is. I think that, relationships, remember, diplomacy, these alliances have been built on one of them, I think, is one of the most important words in the English language, which is trust. And trust has been broken here, guys. And we need to build that back, and we got a lot of work to do it. It's heartbreaking, not just to hear from the king or the prime minister, who are friends of mine, but from my friends on the street of Denmark who love the United States and are both angry and heartbroken by our policies here.
All right, Rufus Gifford, former U.S. ambassador to Denmark, thank you for your insight and analysis. And coming up, President Trump issues a midterm warning today to the GOP. We'll have those details next with Byron Donalds of Florida. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Tyler Kendall. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We thank you for joining us this evening. It was right around this time yesterday we were talking about the big keynote speech at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas by none other than Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia. Had a lot to talk about, including the next generation of high-end AI chips. They're called Rubin, and they promise to bring an enormous amount of additional efficiency and potential cost savings, potentially less need for energy than the Blackwell chips currently on the market that you hear so much about. Sitting down today for an important interview with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, Jensen Huang had this to add.
from Hopper to Blackwell, we increased energy efficiency by 10x. From Blackwell to Rubin, we increased energy efficiency again by 10x. And that translates directly to our customers' revenues, because in the case of an AI factory, whatever factory size you have, you're limited by the power. In order for a new industry to emerge, you need energy. And so I think it's safe to say that we wish we had more energy in the United States. Europe wish it had more energy. I think the world all wish we had more energy. And so we have to invest in all sorts of different forms of energy. Well, the memory bottleneck is severe, but we're fortunate to have worked with all, first of all, Nvidia is the only company that works with all three of the HBM suppliers. And all three of them are major customers and major suppliers of us. And so we have the good fortune of working with them for a very long period of time, and we've got things all planned out.
Jensen Huang speaking earlier on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is why we saw the storage companies rally today. Nvidia didn't move a lot, and we have a moment with Ed Ludlow right now, of course, the co-host of Bloomberg Tech, who's still in Las Vegas. Ed, that was a really fascinating conversation. And look, everyone stops down when Jensen Huang starts talking, and clearly the takeaway here is you can get to any angle when it comes to the AI spend, the AI build out, but nothing is more important than energy. That's why we need these new chips. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the anxiety is that whether the commitment's there to build the data centers or Nvidia has the ability to supply the high-performance compute platforms or the servers themselves, there may not be enough electricity to power them. And, you made a really good point, and it was in the tape as well, that the reason we care so much about the progress of an NVIDIA GPU or its compute system generation to generation is because it does improve efficiency. That doesn't do away with the problem entirely, and that's why in that clip that you played, he went on to talk about the other bottleneck right now, which is memory chips. Memory chips are in short supply, and therefore prices are very high. NVIDIA's in the enviable position where it has command over its supply base, right? None of this is perfect. The conclusion, and you're right, NVIDIA stock didn't go up very much, but the conclusion that NVIDIA would come to it with all of that in mind is that it's better to be in a position where your demand far outpaces your ability to supply than in vice versa, even if right now it's not plain sailing for that company.
Ed, we're pretty focused today on geopolitics, on balance of power. And Jensen Huang told you that right now the company is not directly communicating with the Chinese government. What else can you tell us about the lobbying from NVIDIA when it comes to Chinese market access?
Yeah, we just kind of wanted a straight answer. What's going to happen with China? That in part of the interview was important because he clarified that actually NVIDIA does not speak with the Chinese government in the same way that Jensen Huang communicates directly with the president of the United States. The way that they communicate is with the companies in China. And about an hour after that conversation, Jensen Huang gave a press conference where he took more questions on China. And the two key details that you need to know is that, demand in China is there from the Chinese companies. Whether they're allowed to order them or not, irrespective of what licenses the US grants, will show up in the order book. Of course it will. But he did go slightly further than that in a question from Bloomberg's Ian King to say that he thinks that in this financial forecast they're giving at the moment, the data center, the reason that number might be bigger is because you see H200s from China contributing to it. That's hard to quantify, but I bet you that the analysts are modeling for it now after those comments.
All right, a great conversation and interview. Ed Ludlow, host of Bloomberg Tech, thank you so much. And make sure to stay tuned in the BTech Asia later tonight, where Ed will have more reporting from CES. Turning back to developments here in Washington, President Trump addressing congressional Republicans earlier about the stakes of the midterm elections this November.
You got to win the midterms, because if we don't win the midterms, it's just going to be, they'll find a reason to impeach me. I'll get impeached.
Joining us now with his reaction is Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida. He serves on both the House Financial Services Committee and House Oversight Committee. Congressman, thanks so much for being here. As you just heard, President Trump is talking about the potential of impeachment. Can you put this into context for us? Is there any particular issue that he was pointing to? And is this really a motivating factor for House Republicans come November?
Well, a couple of things. One, I don't think the president was using hyperbole. Listen to Democratic leadership. They're talking about impeachments now. For what? We have no idea. Donald Trump has been following the law, following the Constitution, responsibly executing the powers of the commander-in-chief under Article 2 of the Constitution. What the Democrats are upset about is that their radical agenda was stopped dead in its tracks by the fact that Donald Trump is now the 47th president of the United States. That's the politics. Now switch to policy. What are Democrats actually going to do to improve the lives of the American people? Open borders? That was a failure. They tried that already. Oh, how about hyperinflation? They tried that too, destroyed purchasing power of the American people. So they're not talking about real policy that's impacting the lives of people. All they're doing right now is opposing President Trump. So the president is right to point out the fact that the Democrats are just looking for any reason to oppose him. You have rumblings about them trying to bring up impeachment articles. I think 2 have already come up this Congress that were ridiculous and foolhardy, make no sense. But that's the only thing the Democrats have. They're not talking about the policy solutions to actually make the lives of the American people better. They might talk about it in a speech, but there's no concrete substance behind it. So House Republicans, we're focused on talking about what we've actually accomplished, which is improving our economic situation, supporting President Trump in his policy goals, which secured our border, which have our economy growing very rapidly right now. Wages adjusted for inflation are up for the American people. Gas prices are down, the lowest level since 2021. And then the president is doing his job as commander-in-chief, bringing back the Monroe Doctrine to make sure that the Western Hemisphere is actually working in cooperation with the United States and our interests.
Well, as usual, Congressman, we went from 0 to 60, and I don't know what that was, 30 seconds, but it's great to see you as we go straight for the fastball. Let me ask you about what's going on in Venezuela, because I don't know what exactly the president would be impeached on, but if this is one of the ideas, let's get into it here, because you represent Naples, Florida, which, of course, is a bastion of support for the president. Florida is watching this very closely for a lot of important reasons here. And you've got a constituency, and I know you're running for governor as well, that is very happy about what happened to see Maduro and his wife captured and brought to face charges here in the United States. Is there a playbook here that should or will be repeated in the region when we think about Cuba, when we think about Colombia? What are you hearing from voters?
To be clear, I don't want to get in front of the president. I think it's important for members of Congress, both House and Senate, to not come and pontificate about what they think the next moves are. There is a reason we have a commander-in-chief. There's a reason why he chose former Senator Marco Rubio to be our Secretary of State, so they can go through the diplomatic process and figure out what's the best solution for Venezuela as they work with the United States and what that means for the rest of Central America and the Caribbean. I think that's important, so you don't want to get ahead of that. But it is clear that you had Democrats who almost unanimously condemned Nicolas Maduro under the past administration, wanted to see action against Nicolas Maduro during Joe Biden's presidency, and there was no action. Donald Trump took action. Maduro's going to be held accountable, and now all of a sudden they're code switching simply because their guy didn't do it. They just want to oppose Donald Trump. I think if you're talking about the future of Venezuela specifically, it actually has an opportunity to be a free and bustling society that respects merit, respects property rights, respects individual liberties, something that was not possible with Nicolas Maduro or his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. So Venezuela actually is in the best position it's been in almost 30 years. And my hope is that when it comes to Colombia, when it comes to Nicaragua, when it comes to Cuba, that this move of liberty and freedom actually follows suit throughout Central America and the Caribbean.
Well, you know, we talked to John Bolton about the operation underway, Congressman, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I know that there's a conversation on Capitol Hill about war powers as well, and you're going to get an important briefing on this tomorrow from members of the administration. Bolton, of course, for the benefit of our audience, was National Security Advisor in the first administration and dealt with Maduro at the time. Here's what he told us.
I think that the administration has acted in an ad hoc, day-to-day fashion. That doesn't guarantee failure, but let's be clear, if the objective is to turn Venezuela into a society where its people actually govern it, and maybe that's not Trump's intention, but if that is, they're a long way from it. And anybody who thinks the Venezuelan oil industry is going to emerge from the ashes in a matter of weeks or months or even a couple of years doesn't know how bad the situation is.
I don't know how you'd respond to that, Congressman, but I would ask you specifically about one thing. Is the objective to turn Venezuela into a society where its people will govern it?
Of course, that is the objective. I think if you listen to not only the president, but Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the objective is to make sure that the people of Venezuela have the opportunity to govern their society through free and fair elections. That was not happening under Nicolas Maduro. So I get it. There's a lot of people who want to be Monday morning quarterbacks right now, but we have to acknowledge reality. If President Trump did not act, Maduro would still be down there dancing in his jumpsuit, running that nation into a ground, turning it more and more into a narco-terrorist state that actually is selling oil to the Iranians and to the Chinese. That is not in the interest of the United States of America, no matter your views on foreign policy or on domestic politics. So we have to start somewhere. This is step one. The president, the Secretary of State, and his team, I trust the fact that they have a game plan going forward. And for the American people who might be concerned about next steps, I would say look at what's happening in Iran. They took decisive action with the nuclear program under the Iranian regime. The Iranians were set back, again, in the national interest. And now you're seeing protests of Iranians in the streets of Tehran who want liberty and freedom. That should be what the United States chooses to seek, not just talking about these foreign policy issues but with no action or the wrong actions. And I think for far too many presidents in the current history of the United States, we've seen more inaction and terrible action, not smart policy that puts forward foreign investment, that puts forward liberty, that puts forward economic opportunity for a lot of these countries and their people.
Well, in terms of next steps, we have gotten signals from the administration that part of why they feel they can work with Delcy Rodriguez is because of her expertise in the oil industry. To Joe's question again, do you see any risk here when it comes to potentially delaying the transition to democracy in exchange for waiting for Venezuela's economy to get on more sound footing with the revival of Venezuelan oil production?
Well, the one thing I will say is that you have to make sure the conditions on the ground are good. I think it's important for that. I think if you ran out there and did snap elections today, depending on what the power dynamics are on the ground, you could actually end up getting right back to where you were, which is having a dictator run that country. So I think it's prudent to make sure the conditions on the ground are correct before elections are brought in. If you're going to talk to the interim leader down there in Venezuela, I think that's a determination of the president and of the Secretary of State. They have far more information at their fingertips than you or I do, or even the American people right now. This is why we elect the president. They are supposed to be the commander-in-chief, the director of our foreign policy. We need to take a step back, take a beat, let President Trump work and do what is necessary. Because I think if you take a look at his foreign policy decisions, first term and this term, it's without question, they're far better than any president in the last 35 years.
Yeah, I'm getting the hook here, Congressman, because we're out of time. But just quickly, do those oil companies deserve to be subsidized? Should that operation be subsidized by the United States to accelerate the process in the Venezuelan oil fields?
I'm not really interested in subsidies per se. I think the oil markets themselves will provide all of the ability for companies, if they go back in, to rebuild that infrastructure. To be able to make money. I don't think it's much more about subsidies. I think it's much more about a stable government in Venezuela, stable security apparatus. If those things are in place, there'll be plenty of opportunity, whether it's oil companies or any other company, to go in, invest in Venezuela. And through that foundation, you'll have the Venezuelan people actually be able to earn a living, to build wealth for themselves, and to reinvigorate a healthy, growing, stable economy in Venezuela and hopefully in the entire region.
It's always good to have you. Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida, we thank you for being with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, the Justice Department says in a filing that less than 1% of the Epstein files have been made public. We've got details on the delay coming up. Plus, is Greenland the next target? We'll discuss the administration's plans for the territory and European leaders' reaction when we assemble our panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. The Justice Department says it has released less than 1% of its files related to Jeffrey Epstein, according to a court filing. Attorney General Pam Bondi writing that more than 2 million documents are still being reviewed by department personnel, noting that, quote, substantial work remains to be done, unquote. It is unclear just exactly how long the undertaking will take or when the next batch of files will be released.
And Republican Representative Doug LaMalfa passed away Monday after serving 13 years in Congress. President Trump honored him during his speech earlier today, calling him a reliable ally. The president also sent well wishes to Indiana Representative Jim Baird and his wife, who were hospitalized in a car accident this morning. House Republicans are dealing with an increasingly tight 218 to 213 margin, including Marjorie Taylor Greene's retirement earlier this week.
We assembled our political panel now for comments on all the news we're following today. Lester Munson is with us, our Republican strategist and head of the international practice at BGR Group, alongside Democratic strategist Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden. It's always great to have the two of you with us, and Happy New Year to both of you. I think I can still say that now. Just don't ask Larry David. A remarkable moment today at the Kennedy Center. Donald Trump speaking to the Republican House Conference 5 years to the day after the January 6 riots, saying, if you lose the midterms, I get impeached and the country is ruined. Is he right?
Well, I don't know. I don't think the country is going to be ruined.
Well, let's start with the first two.
If the Republicans lose the House, will the Democrats impeach President Trump? Seems likely.
Really?
They did it twice in 4 years during the first term. So, average about once every 2 years. They'd have 2 years.
What does he get impeached on this time?
Well, you could investigate one thing for several months and then decide you're going to impeach him over something else, which I think is what happened the last time.
Interesting.
I suppose they make, Democrats are trying to make the argument that the effort to remove Maduro from Venezuela was an illegal act. I totally disagree with that, but they are trying to make that argument. It's possible they use that as the basis for an impeachment.
But, Megan, is potential impeachment from either side of the aisle, Democrats either talking about it potentially against President Trump or President Trump talking about it potentially against himself, is that really a viable argument for the midterms? When we talk so much around this table about how economic policies, kitchen table issues is really what resonates with Americans.
No, nobody cares. Actual voters don't care if there's oversight hearings. You can see that from the oversight hearings they had for President Biden and the auto pen. Americans do not care about that. They care about if they can afford their gas and their groceries and their cost of living. And if people don't start focusing on that, then the party that will focus on that the first will be the ones that win.
How about Republican, or rather Democratic leadership on Capitol Hill? Is there an appetite to impeach Donald Trump?
Oh, I'm sure Democrats will love to do that, and I'm sure they'll love to haul every single person up to the oversight committee to do all of the hearings that they just did against all the Democrats. At some point in time, all of it needs to stop, and they need to focus on the American people and what's best for them, and affordability issues is what's really actually going to be best for them. So, I mean, it's their job to investigate and have oversight hearings. I'm just not sure that's where the American people want to see their taxpayer dollars and their time from their members of Congress being spent.
Okay, well, let's talk about one potential kitchen table issue. I think there's some through threads here, and that's because President Trump today spoke about the Supreme Court case and his tariff policies. Take a listen to what he had to say.
We're getting rich because of tariffs, by the way. I hope everyone understands that. They hate to report. We're going to have over $650 billion poured into our country or coming in shortly because of tariffs. They're finding all of these pockets of money. A couple of weeks ago, sir, we're off by $39 billion. Oh, is that good or bad? Meaning, do we have it or are we short of it? Sir, it's $39 billion that we can't account for. I said, check the tariff shelf.
So I believe it's $195 billion in net revenue for last fiscal year, but some of that could be going away depending on how the Supreme Court rules. We potentially could get an opinion on Friday. That's the first day that we potentially can, Lester. But how much of this could be a political problem when we know that so much of this administration's economic policies are tied to tariffs?
I actually don't think the tariff issue in and of itself is something that impacts Americans' pocketbooks. I don't particularly think they're a good thing. I disagree with the president on that. It really does take money out of the economy that otherwise Americans could use for other things. But it hasn't had a huge impact on economic growth or job growth or that kind of thing. What it does do is give the president leverage in a bunch of negotiations with other countries and gives him things that he can do if he needs to maybe make it look like he's adjusting the economy, which is something every president wants. They want to look like they're in charge, and they want to look like they can manipulate these things for the American people. Totally agree with Megan. At the end of the day, the thing that's going to matter are pocketbook issues. What Trump was trying to do earlier is say Democrats are focused on impeaching me. They're not focused on pocketbook issues.
Interesting. Well, of course, if the Supreme Court tells us Friday or whenever they decide to rule on this that they're striking down the tariff regime, I don't know if Ed McMahon shows up with a bunch of big rebate checks or how that's going to work exactly. But politically speaking, we've asked this before. Does the court save Donald Trump from himself and help Republicans' chances in the midterms?
I think if you start giving rebate checks, it just admits to the American people that your economic policies were not working and that you are now trying to give them money to buy back their goodwill.
But that would presumably let prices come down again and the markets would rally.
I don't know a world in a scenario in which a chip company raises the cost of chips and then or chips as in food and then not computer chips and then they go back down because the Supreme Court ruled. I don't think it doesn't change. Once when prices go up on things, they typically do not come back down. And then you can talk till you're blue in face about inflation or GDP or job growth. American people do not understand, and they don't understand the impacts of that in their everyday lives because that doesn't impact their cost of gas or groceries and how much money they have at the end of the month. Those are lagging indicators that it takes months and months to catch up to. And I just think that those talking points are for media and for economists. Those aren't for people who are middle America who are just trying to survive every day.
And right now, we're not really talking about the economy, right? We're talking about Venezuela. Is this an issue that Republicans want to have on the table right now?
Well, right now, I mean, we're 10 months before the election. I think it's fine to have it on the table for Republicans. President Trump is clearly trying to make Venezuela into a domestic issue. He wants to make the case to his base in particular, us taking out Maduro is good for the economy. We're going to reap the benefits of increased oil production. We're going to have increased trade with Venezuela. We're going to stop drugs from coming into our country. He wants to make this a domestic issue. Those are the things he hit on in his comments after the Maduro operation over the weekend.
Does that work with the MAGA base? We ended up on the Daily Show last night because we were asking people if this was going to cause a split in MAGA. Is that a joke or could that in fact happen?
I don't think there's going to be a split in MAGA.
Jon Stewart doesn't either.
No, yeah. I mean, Trump, they look to Trump. He's making the case. He's not turning his back on them. He is directly talking to them when he talks about those issues in Venezuela.
But I do think with Venezuela, the problem here is that people are now paying more for their health care and the government could potentially shut down again. So this only can go so far with the American people. And I just think that we have reached a point where the economy is all people care about. So you can talk about this for 48 hours, but it doesn't change the fact that people can't afford their health care.
All right. Our political panel, Lester Munson and Megan Hayes, thank you both. To learn more about all of these stories that you heard tonight, make sure to check out the Washington Edition newsletter.
Find it on the terminal and online. We'll meet you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power, only here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.